AI is always going to get crushed by human intelligence for as long as business remains dynamic. That's according to Angus Fletcher, professor of story science and author of the bestseller Primal Intelligence, my book of 2025. Angus reveals what makes leadership distinctive, how internal and external stories work, and why the 3 stories every business runs on need to be aligned for business to succeed. And if you still think that storytelling is a soft skill, well, Angus works closely with US Special Forces, helping elite operators take decisions in highly uncertain, high-risk environments where failure isn't an option, which sounds a lot like leadership to me. Enjoy this conversation, which broke my mental model. Is storytelling a skill, or is it more than that?
Story is more than a skill. It's a natural process of the human brain that you can practice getting better at over time.
In your book, you write it's a form of intelligence. And there's logic is a form of intelligence, and story is a form of intelligence. So please speak to that.
Yeah, so a lot of times we think of story as just storytelling. But as I talk about in the book, actually the primary function of story is thinking. The primary function of story is story thinking, or to be technical, narrative cognition. And the simple way to think about this is that another word for a story is a plot, and another word for a plot is a plan. So story evolved in the human brain to help you make plans. It helped you to imagine new ways to accomplish things. And this makes it different than logic, which is another intelligent process, because logic, which evolved out of the visual cortex, is there to process huge amounts of information and find patterns in them. And so essentially logic, which is what computers do, is great in really rich, information-rich, stable environments that don't change a lot, and it can help you find sort of ways to optimize those environments. But you need story in any low information environment, and you also need story to innovate.
Wow. So in a way, humans think in story.
So computers think entirely in logic. Humans think partly in logic and mostly in story. And you'll know this because when you think about your day, you don't think about your day as a sequence of numbers or a sequence of correlations. What you do is you think about your day as this happened and this happened, or you think about this is what I want to do tomorrow. Or when you meet someone for the first time, the first thing you do is you exchange your life narratives. You say, where did you come from? And so on and so forth. And let's make plans for the future. And the reason for that is that stories are actions. They're sequences of actions. And the way that life works is you have to act. Action is what leads to success in life. And on a basic level, those actions can be things like, getting resources, getting food, finding mates, things like that in a kind of boring way. But on a business level, it's what are we building in terms of our product or our processes? Where are we going? What are our plans? What are our strategies? And none of that stuff is algorithmic. All that stuff is narrative. And that's why humans are the master of business, and why, in my humble estimation, AI is never going to run a company.
AI is never going to run a company. That's a bold statement that goes contrary to what a lot of, the very knowledgeable people who study AI and promote AI, they say the opposite, right? It's going to be better than anything a human can do by, let's say, 2030.
Well, let's be clear. People who actually know about AI and who are not selling AI are quite skeptical about, I think, current existing systems. And to the extent that they believe that there is the capacity for AI to evolve, it's usually some mix of symbolic and kind of neural net thing that we haven't seen yet, neurosymbolic logic, something like that. That can only be true if you assume that the rules of business don't change. So in other words, AI could only be intelligent if you could program a symbolic system with a stable set of rules that are eternal over time. But actually, the reality of business is that it thrives on innovation, which is making new rules, which is disrupting, your competitors' rules and your competitors' activities. So as long as business remains a dynamic, which is to say biological as opposed to logical environment, and AI is always going to get crushed by human intelligence.
So there's a difference in design between the human brain and AI. AI is not a simulation of the human brain.
Oh, AI is definitely not a simulation of the human brain. So first of all, the human brain is not designed. AI is designed. We build AI, we understand how it works. The human brain evolved through a process known as evolution by natural selection. And very famously, that rests on a rejection of design. Charles Darwin rejected design. Yeah. So the human brain is not designed. The human brain does things that you can't do in a design system. So for example, the human brain leverages conflict. It leverages tension. It does all sorts of interesting things like lean into exceptions and anomalies and singularities. These are all things which are impossible for computational systems because of the way in which they work. And the important kind of broader point here is that life itself is not designed. There's no way to kind of design success in life. What you have to do is you have to initiate an action and then learn through feedback as you see the effects and the results of that action. Another way of thinking about that is that life is like being a storyteller. You launch a story, you see how your audience responds, you adapt your story in real time. This is what Shakespeare did. This is what any storyteller does, is it's an interactive process as opposed to a designed process. So that's the kind of core mechanical difference between the two.
That's important to establish. And, I just wanted us to be very clear about the difference between AI and the human brain. And you mentioned that the human brain is obviously capable of story and logic. Those are two forms of intelligence. Is it 50-50? Has it evolved at the same time? Or how would I imagine this? Or is one more important than the other?
So both logic and story evolved in the human brain. Well, they evolved in the animal neuron, we should say, to be totally accurate about it, more than 500 million years ago. So probably about maybe 530, 540 million years ago. They evolved together. The fact that they both continue to exist shows that neither of them is adequate for all intellectual tasks. They're tools. So, just like a hammer and a saw are different tools with different functions. The logic function primarily evolved to help us with vision, which is to identify food, to kind of spot patterns that recur in the environment. So anytime you think about a sense-making organ, what you're thinking about there is a logic process. The reason for narrative is to initiate new actions, to initiate new behaviors, to evolve, essentially. So anytime you're thinking about action creation or innovation or anything like that, you're thinking about that part of the human brain. And what we think originally is that creativity and narrative evolved to help you escape from being eaten. So essentially what we think is if you go back 530 million years ago, there was this thing known as the biological Big Bang. All of a sudden, animal life was proliferating across the planet. That created this enormous competition for food. And so vision evolved to help animals start to see food and go after it. But at the same time, of course, as all these animals are seeing things that they want to eat and going after them, that means that you, as an animal in that environment, have to avoid being eaten by one of those things that's seeing. And so the kind of function of narrative, the function of creativity, the function of imagination is essentially to break logic by doing things that break the pattern of previous behaviors. And so innovation, we think, evolved as a way to keep you from being consumed by your adversaries.
Yeah. Wow. That is such an important insight that I had never heard articulated before I read your book, which is my book of the year last year, Primal Intelligence. And is this something that came out of your studies? I mean, you're a professor of story science, by the way, a job title I'm very envious of. I think that sounds really cool. And is that just, something you discovered in your lab, or how did this come about?
Yeah, so this is something that I discovered in my lab, but in concert with a lot of other research partners. So to give you the quick story about this is I started out in neurophysiology, which is a branch of neuroscience which studies living neurons. Essentially, it studies how neurons talk to each other. And one of the things that I started to realize working in the neuroscience lab was that neurons operated very mechanically differently from transistors, and the human brain operated very differently from a computer. And I wanted to study that, and I wanted to understand that. And one of the things that I realized is that neurons exist to create and communicate actions. And so I thought, what I'll do is I'll go study storytellers, and I'll go study sort of writers and artists who engage in narrative. And so I went off and I got my PhD in that. And then I got a chance to work in Hollywood and work with folks at places like Pixar and whatnot, sort of understanding how stories were made. But up until about the last 6 or 7 years, all of my theories about the human brain and how it worked and how you could train up processes like intuition and imagination and common sense and all these mental powers that computers don't have, all of these theories remained theories because I was considered this kind of rogue thinker. No one was really willing to kind of back my research and sort of do large-scale trials of it until about 5 years ago, I got a knock on my door from U.S. Army Special Operations, a couple of classified units within Joint Special Operations Command. Specifically, I can't actually name them, but your audience could probably go look them up on the internet. And they said, "Hey, Angus, we know that everyone thinks you're kind of a little bit nuts and you're kind of this outlier. But, we, the U.S. Army, essentially invented artificial intelligence. We work with, all these companies. We have all these very advanced systems. And we've noticed all the things that you're saying about artificial intelligence are true. It's very fragile in chaotic environments. It's unable to function when it doesn't have a lot of information. It hallucinates wildly. It's not good with edge cases. And what we've noticed is that some humans are good at edge cases. We've noticed that some humans are very smart in volatile, chaotic environments. And we think that those humans are running the same processes that you're talking about. And so, Professor Fletcher, would you like to test your theories? Would you like to see if you take your theories about the human brain and you give them to these elite operators, if you can make them more effective in these chaos environments? And do you think we could kind of build a little bit of a training system for folks who aren't as good as these operators to train them up to the level of the best operators that we have, to sort of break down those mental processes that allow those operators to make plans under pressure? And so, of course, they said, yes, that would be amazing. Who wouldn't want to do that? And I've been able to spend the last 4 years working with the United States Army, and they've given my lab a couple of medals for groundbreaking research to sort of help sort of support what we found. And as you say, all the results of that are published in that book, Primal Intelligence, which became a bestseller in the United States last year.
Yeah, I'm not surprised because it's such a brilliant book. And so obviously this implies that it was successful. So the special operations operators, they became better, more effective, thanks to something you taught them. So can you teach us what you taught them so we can become more alert, more better?
One of the things I want to say to be clear is that a lot of what we did is we went in there and we studied the best operators, and then we took those brain processes and gave them to everybody else. And what that allowed you to do, what that allows special operations to do, is sort of elevate everyone up to this kind of same elite level. So as an example, what we think is that the starting point of what I would call narrative cognition or thinking in story is a power known as intuition. And intuition is pretty famously defined by computer scientists and folks like Daniel Kahneman as a pattern match, which would suggest that computers have incredible intuition because computers are great at pattern matching. But actually it turns out that computers are very bad at intuition. Computers are not good at anticipating the future. Computers are not good at spotting opportunities. So when we started working with the operators, what we discovered was that operators who had intuition, in fact, did the opposite of a pattern match. What they did is they spotted an exception. They spotted something that broke a rule of the previous environment. And then they were able to take that exception and say, well, what if I made that exception the new rule? What would life look like then? And so that process of being able to very rapidly identify exceptions in the environment. And what we see, for example, in children are much better than adults at spotting exceptions because as an adult, you learn to kind of develop efficiency. You learn to kind of filter out things that make you non-productive. You lean into patterns as a source of productivity. But you can go back to your child brain and start to activate this natural power that you have to spot exceptions by doing simple things, for example, like traveling. The more you travel, the more you immerse yourself in environments where everything is exceptional. And so that starts to kind of wake up your child brain and help kind of make you think, oh, there are things out here which break my rules. So that's one kind of example of something you can do. Improve your intuition by getting a little bit out of your daily routine. And instead of judging things that are different from the way you expect, start to lean into those exceptions and say, what would happen if I had more of them?
Yeah. And this is how business opportunities and innovation originates often, right? We spot the exception. Hang on. Why has no one noticed this? Is there something?
That's right. Yeah. And if you talk to a lot of people if you go back to sort of like, the 60s and 70s, a lot of sort of hedge funds and a lot of these investment opportunities came just from people leaving the United States or leaving Europe and going to other parts of the world and seeing how things were operating there and realizing, oh my goodness, there's all these opportunities there. And so on a very basic level, a lot of wealth was generated in the later 20th century simply by literally getting out of your financial district and walking into another district and seeing what was happening there. And I think one of the problems is the more that people have gotten sort of used to these digital lives, they spend more and more of their time in front of their computer. And your computer can only connect you to things that other people are already seeing because your computer is all part of this digital web. And so really, you've got to literally get out of your comfort zone. You've got to actually walk to places, have conversations with other people outside of these digital spaces. And successful business people know that. Successful entrepreneurs know that. And that's the sort of, spark that usually ignites the fire of innovation.
That's right. I like to make this very actionable for leaders. You write that your business runs on 3 stories. Strategy is the story of what your organization wants to do. Operations is the story of what your organization is doing, and marketing is the story of what your organization wants people to think it is doing. In successful organizations, these three stories are aligned. In dysfunctional organizations, they diverge, creating inauthentic marketing and communications.
Yeah, that's right. So part of the reason that I came up with this kind of strategy, operations, marketing is because I'm an expert in story. So I get brought in a lot and asked to consult on marketing. And one of the things you often notice in companies is this major disjunction between marketing and then the actual operations and strategy. So people are trying to sell you what they wish that they were making, is another way of saying that, and they're trying to convince their customers to buy something that they're not actually producing. And so one of the first hard conversations I almost always have with companies is like, that is a disastrous long-term strategy because your customers are going to get very, very angry. Your marketing team is essentially going to be lying. You're asking your marketing team to lie. So let's start to get in alignment. And if we want to get in alignment, we can start with the marketing that you have. And we can say, how do we build backwards from that marketing into operations and then into strategy? So if you want to tell the world, we're building a widget that does this thing, how do you actually build that widget? What changes do you need to make in your operations to get it so that your widget is as reliable as you're claiming, or what changes do you need to make in your strategy so that that's actually the widget that you're creating? Because otherwise you're sending out your sales force to try and convince people to buy something that the sales force themselves wouldn't buy. And part of the reason for this is that in a healthy company, you always need the sales force bringing back the insights and responses of customers into operations and into strategy so that companies can learn from what's happening. And you have to have this story cycling through your whole company where operations and strategy is listening to marketing and we're all getting on the same page. And when that happens, you have real success because that way marketing isn't trying to convince people to buy something that they themselves wouldn't buy. They're saying, this is actually a great product. It's actually doing what I'm saying. And all I have to do is break through the noise and start to get those customers to connect. And once those customers connect, they're really going to like it. They're going to tell other people. And then our job as marketing is over because the story is now alive in the world. And the story is spreading itself because the story is accurate and honest, as opposed to we have to keep going in there and reinforcing it, which is really propaganda. Propaganda is when you're telling a story that does not align with reality. So you have to keep reinforcing it.
That's right. It's a very short-termist strategy, right? There's a much better strategy, which is this, this is what we could be together or create together. It was very interesting what you said about marketing. And I hear this sometimes as well from leaders who say, I think we have a marketing problem or a communications problem. I say, well, maybe, but there's another explanation here. Namely, using your description, these three stories, strategy, operations, and marketing, are not aligned. So the poor folks in marketing are forced to sell inauthentic products or services, which is either unsuccessful or just very expensive, right? Because they have to push out so much to get something in return.
That's right. And there are other cases where, marketing is failing. And one of the ways in which marketing fails, so there are plenty of companies I work with which have a great product that they're failing to sell. So, this is the other case scenario. So case one is, you're trying to sell something which isn't very good and you're forcing your marketing team to essentially lie. Case two is you've actually got a great product, but you're not selling it. What's going on there? And generally what's happening there is the marketing team is failing to have the courage to actually say what's different and unique about your product. Because what happens a lot of times when you have a initial marketing campaign is you're like, well, how do we fit into the existing narrative that everybody else is telling? So how do we convince everybody else that our product is just as good as these other products that are already selling? Why is it that Pepsi is exactly the same as Coke would be a simple way of saying it, And actually what you've got to do when you've got a really good product is go out there and be like, this is why we're different. This is different. And so super simple example of this, what was IBM's main marketing strategy in the 60s and 70s? Their main slogan was think. So if you went anywhere and you saw an IBM, it would say think over it. Think, 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 think. What did Steve Jobs do to sell Apple in the 80s and 90s? He changed that slogan to think different. And so the entire point there is, this is why we're not IBM, come try us because we're not IBM. And in retrospect, that seems obvious because everybody loves Apple and everyone thinks Apple is great. But at the time, that was like, wait, what? You're saying you're not a computer? You're a computer that's not a computer? But that's what marketing has to do. Marketing has to have the courage to identify what is exceptional, what is singular, what is anomalous, what breaks the pattern about your product. Why is that product an innovation? Why is it exceptional? Why does it defeat expectations? Why does it create surprise and wonder? And that requires courage on the marketing team and, of course, the support of operations and strategy.
Yes, it's that strategic idea of a strategic enemy, right? Because my understanding is the brain isn't good in deciphering what is better or who is better. But if it's different, that's pretty easy to understand for us.
Yeah, well, the human brain evolved to spot difference. So if something is different, what that's telling your brain is that it's either an opportunity or a threat. The kind of core function of the human brain in terms of its sensory perception network is to identify new threats and new opportunities. That's the main thing that it's interested in, because otherwise it can just continue going along, sort of chewing the grass or sort of engaging in its existing habits, essentially. But the moment that something new happens, the brain's like, okay, now I've got to actually think. I've got to respond. And so the primary basis of all intelligence is that moment of surprise, or as we might call it, wonder. So, because, there's this moment of wow, wonder, but then wonder like, I'm wondering where this is going. So wonder is this kind of thing that you as a marketer have to hack into immediately. You first of all got to make people go, wow, like I was not expecting that. And then you've got to make them wonder, where is this going? And I don't want to miss out, right? If it's going somewhere good, I want to get on that. Like I want to be one of the first people to adopt this product. And on the other hand, if this is signaling a danger, I want to be the first person to protect myself by getting this product and using it to kind of shield me from whatever kind of bad things are out there. And so that's the key to break through, is wonder.
Interesting. And when you tell business leaders about these three stories and maybe there's a lack of alignment in their organization, how do they react?
Well, so I suppose it depends on the business leader, But, my experience is that the way that particularly American industry works, a lot of folks at the top of companies are not actually leaders, they're actually managers. And so what's happened is they've got there because they're very good at running the company as it currently exists. They're a great COO, would be another way of saying it, who's been moved into a CEO position. And so when you're talking to folks who have become really, really good at managing, they don't understand the need to have these dynamic changes, because they basically just think, well, I'm just going to keep the company running the way that it was running. If you talk to folks who have a kind of more entrepreneurial background, or folks who have a background maybe more in sales or some other area where you constantly have to be reactive and responsive to the environment, constantly have to keep adapting. So in other words, someone who isn't a creature of the inside of the company, but someone who has spent their time outside the company or on the kind of, threshold of the company in the outside world, that person immediately understands the three stories, because that person is saying, yes, absolutely. What my company is it's a dynamic action. It's an activity, and that activity is interacting with the outside world. And so, of course, stories are the way that I take that chaos of activity and simplify it into sequences of this leads to that. And so those folks are very open to the idea that if they're having a problem with marketing, the problem in marketing actually might be a problem in operations or a problem in strategy. So you can usually tell a lot about whether someone is a leader or a manager in terms of their comfort level with story.
That is so true. That is so true. And it's weird, right? Because there's this big problem I see that much of communication business fails because we expect people, or some managers, leaders expect people to behave purely logically, which they obviously don't. So if the story is, or the lack of story is, the fact-telling, here's the info, now let's go, that doesn't work. Or a story that simply backfires, like, let's say a company is worried about what AI will do to the industry, and the leader may say something like, AI is coming for our industry, we have to change, otherwise we are screwed, let's go. Right? Again, that doesn't work.
No, it doesn't work at all. And if you have a managerial psychology, you're incredibly risk averse. And if you're risk averse, you're going to be a dreadful communicator, because the entire purpose of communications is to generate a sense of suspense in your audience. The human brain evolved to be interested by things that it doesn't totally understand. And so the classic way to kind of generate interest is to give people sort of exactly half of a story. And then they're like, well, what's the rest? Or to give them a riddle or a paradox or a puzzle, or something that forces them to be like, what's happening here? And that's how you engage interest. And then once you've got the interest engaged, you can then start to have this kind of more candid conversation where you start to move things and you can pass information. But if all you're doing is emitting data, that's how one computer communicates with another computer. And that's because computers are entirely passive objects. And so if you have this managerial psychology, which is risk averse, and you don't want to take a chance and put yourself out there and try to do something new, because anytime you try to do something new, you never know in advance if it's going to work. This is another thing I think that sometimes people who are not leaders struggle with, is there's no way in advance to know if something new is going to work. You have to try it. Now, you can know in advance that, a leader or a marketer is going to succeed because that person has a history of trying new things. And when those new things don't work, that person has a history of adapting and reacting and responding. So you can have confidence in individuals, but you can't have confidence in any individual marketing tagline or anything like that. You've just got to throw it out there and see what happens and respond. And if you have this very kind of conservative managerial mindset, you're just you've already lost from the beginning because you've kind of workshopped something to death to the point that it's bland, has nothing of interest, and it's not going to grab anybody's attention.
Are you sick and tired of spending 8 hours preparing for a 1-hour presentation? You're not alone. That's why I created my tactical guide, 50 presentation hacks. It's for free. Grab it in the show notes. It's a paradox, right? That what is seemingly risk averse is actually a high risk strategy, especially in a rapidly evolving world. What looks like a risky strategy, namely to try things to experiment, is actually the safer bet.
Yeah, well, and to even double down on what you're saying, it's not that the low risk strategy is high risk, it's that the low risk strategy is actually doomed. It's actually doomed, right? It can't actually work. And this is another reason why AI, I think, is a non-starter in marketing. I think AI has had kind of a brief period over the past year or so where it's had some successes. And why has it had some successes? Because it's new. And because it's new, people want to try it. And there's a certain interest factor around anything that's new. But the whole point of AI is to be generic. AI, what it does is it synthesizes vast amounts of human creativity into a pattern. So basically, it exists to create a kind of surreal blandness. That's the whole function of AI. And once people can start to recognize that surreal blandness, it no longer becomes interesting. And so people are no longer going to pay attention and they tune out. Whereas humans have the ability to be constantly interesting. That's what we've been doing for hundreds of thousands of years, is we've been coming up with new ways to interest each other. And, marketers and storytellers are amazing at that. Every story is a series of cliffhangers and hooks and teasers and all these kinds of things. And that's why the future, I think, is going to lie in human marketers taking those intelligent risks, which, as you say, are the safest path forward in an unsafe world. And, the more practice you have as a storyteller, the more confidence you can have that even if this risk doesn't work, I'm going to figure out a way to save it with my audience because I'm going to take another risk based off their response.
That makes so much sense. The Wall Street Journal titled a few weeks ago, "Companies are desperately seeking storytellers." And I think we all see that this is such a necessary and not skill, form of intelligence, as we now know. And for those who think that AI will be great in marketing, just look at the 20 or 50 messages we receive today on all channels, which are clearly written by AI and sent to us in bulk. We're not going to react to those. We're not even going to open these messages. We're just going to ignore them. So a system or marketing approach that leads to people being completely ignorant of what you've created is simply not going to work. And that should be obvious by now.
Yeah, well, this is another reason why AI is actually not that intelligent. AI is an attempt to brute force everything. The core of AI is we can just brute force all problems. And in the case of, it being quote unquote intelligent, it just gets all the data and tries to find the patterns in it, And in the case of marketing, what it does is it just spams out vast quantities of material. And the problem is that as a human audience for this spam, you get exhausted almost immediately and you just tune out. And so it's having no breakthrough whatsoever. Whereas as a human being, you can very quickly start to identify what's unique about my audience. And our audience wants that signal from us. The moment we start to signal to the audience, hey, I see what's special about you, I see what's unique about you, we then start to open the door to trust. Our audience isn't going to trust us immediately just because we see what's unique about them, but that's the first step. And then once we can take that, hey, I see what's unique about you, and then I can give you something that fits that unique need, then the trust starts to happen. And so communications is never about spamming out vast quantities of material. This idea that somehow AI is going to write emails, I just think is bonkers. And I know that there are all these people out there using AI to write emails, and nobody's reading those emails, right? They're just feeding them into other AI, to kind of like summarize and so on and so forth. And we've just created this giant kind of spam loop. Whereas human communication is not efficient, it's effective. In other words, it's not about increasing productivity or increasing numbers. It's about using the smallest amount of energy to achieve the maximum results. And that comes from expertise in marketing. That comes from storytellers who spent a long time studying audiences and dwelling in different storytelling traditions. So they have a wide range of tools to draw from, which allows them that kind of flexibility to come in and launch the marketing campaign in that moment that has the biggest odds of breaking through.
That is so true. And that's why I wrote this ebook, 21 Storytelling Frameworks, because, you read a storytelling book and many are great and I love them, but there's one framework. The author says, here's my framework. And cool. But I collected all of these and, it ended up to be 21 for whatever reason. There's certainly more, but at the end of the day, they fit into certain archetypes. And I just love to have these at my disposal. So I started to write these down for myself, understanding them, internalizing them, and then just started to share them freely with everyone. So this is totally in line with how I work and I think. You wrote something super interesting and you brought this down to a very fundamental level. How do you tell a story externally and how do you tell a story internally, and what the difference is in the structure and approach?
Yeah, so telling a story externally, all we mean by that is how do I, as a company, get my story out there? And the way that I, as a company, get my story out there is I start by understanding how story works in the human brain. And how does story work in the human brain? Well, the way the story works in the human brain is every story in the human brain starts in the middle. This seems odd, maybe when you first encounter it. Why would that happen? Well, that's because what happens is I'm a human. I'm one
action movies.
That's right. Every action movie starts with a teaser, which throws you into the middle. So they've learned the secret. And in your real life, the way that story works is you're just wandering around, and all of a sudden you're surprised by something. And you're like, wait, why am I surprised? You're like, well, because this is a new story that I wasn't expecting. And then the first question your brain asks when it's surprised is, well, where did this come from? Like, why is this happening? And so your brain jumps from a middle into an imagined beginning. And then once it has that beginning, the next thing your brain goes is, well, where is this going? And then it jumps forward into an imagined future. So narrative in the human brain is constantly going middle, beginning, end, middle, beginning, end, middle, beginning, end. And to your point, action movies work the same way. They start in the middle with a teaser. Then they say, 5 days ago, this is what happened. And they jump you back to the beginning, and then they run you through to the end. And good marketing campaigns are the same way. They jump you into the middle of an experience, which makes you go, wow, what is happening? Where did this come from? And then they tell you the story of the product or how it emerged or how it originated. And then they leave you as the audience to imagine where it's going. So in other words, they start with the middle, they give you the beginning, and then they leave you to imagine the end. And when your audience is imagining the end, they are basically creating the story, the future story of your company. And they've become your marketers. And you don't have to worry about selling them anything anymore because they're going to be putting on the Nike shoes and saying, here's what victory looks to me,
So they become the protagonist. The audience turns into the protagonist.
Yeah, they turn into your co-creator. And then to your other question about what internal communications is. Well, internal communications is when you're the leader of a company and you're trying to get everybody on the same story. It's like, how do we all work together here at this company? I've had the opportunity over the last couple of years to work with a lot of big companies. And one of the disasters that occurs is when a CEO comes up with a list of 5 objectives or something like that. These are our 5 priorities. Right. And that's how computers think. Computers think in lists. The human brain thinks in narratives. So the human brain can only ever have one priority at a time. Your job as a leader is to identify the top priority, not to give people a list of multiple priorities. So the first thing you got to do is you got to say to people, this is our top priority. This is our destination. This is kind of, where we're going. So you set a clear end goal for people. You tell them, this is the end of the story. This is what success looks like. Then you explain to them why we're going there. What's the reason, that we're going there? And that's the beginning of the story. That's what motivates the story. So you give them the end, you give them the beginning, and then you let your organization figure out the middle themselves. In other words, you give them the freedom to figure out how to do their task. You set the overall narrative, but then you give them the autonomy to say, hey, here's how I'm going to go up this mountain. Here's going to be the path that I find. And that does lots of things. First of all, it unleashes the initiative and the imagination of everyone in your company because they can find creative middles that you wouldn't have found before. And it also just eliminates burnout in companies because instead of treating people like little widgets that you can program and tell them exactly what to do the entire time, you're allowing them to take ownership of the story that you're creating, but you're giving them the safe part of the story. You're giving them the middle so that all of a sudden you don't wake up and find that they've gone somewhere else you weren't intending, So that's how internal communications work is end, beginning, and then allow the middle to be your employee's responsibility.
Wow. So to recap for myself, external story, middle, beginning, end. Middle, beginning, end. Internal story, end, beginning, middle. Did I get this right?
Correct. That's totally correct. And this is something we've tested again and again and again with special operations in battlefield conditions. So we know that it works, no matter how chaotic, no matter how hectic your environment is, as long as you as a leader can set a clear end and give a beginning, your team will figure out the middle. And in terms of external comms, if you can catch people with the middle of your story and then get them to create the ends, your job is done.
Yeah. I mean, many of the storytelling frameworks I use and teach and work through with leaders that, they're essentially based on this insight without me having these, because we know from what works, it just, I was lacking the neurological insight that you've contributed here, which is why this is so valuable. So for instance, internally, you often want to start with the vision, right? You don't want to start with the problem unless it's a very small problem that can be solved in the next meeting. But generally speaking, you start with the exciting part, the vision, and then build up from that. And yes, ideally let people run because they understand what the goal is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So this whole idea that we should start with the problem or start by defining the problem, which by the way is the basis of design thinking, is what is like the traps you. Nikola Tesla says this very famously. He says, I don't believe in iteration, I believe in innovation. And I don't believe in defining the problem. I believe in defining the strategy. In your case, vision. Also, I have to say, I'm tremendously impressed by the fact that you have 21 different types of story, because I'm totally on board with that insofar as the entire purpose of, teaching people is to give them simple tools that they can use and to show them, here's a story framework, here's a story framework, here's a story framework. But you don't ever want to then take the next step and say, here's the one archetypal story that you must tell in every situation. It must always be a hero's journey, because that gets you away from the biological function of story, which is innovation, and which is listening to your audience and responding to them. And so I can tell already that you're a master practitioner. That, all the science that I'm giving you is simply there to kind of reinforce what you've already discovered through your practice.
And I do think if people put into practice, leaders and organizations put into practice what you've discovered, that is a hard economic competitive advantage, because many do not understand it, or if they understand, they don't apply it, which means they're working against human nature. And if you're dealing with customers, investors, and talent, you rather be dealing with or, have biology working for you rather than you working against biology.
Yes, like is not logical, like is biological, and it's a good thing that it is. And so, as a CEO, you've got to get out of your math equations and your spreadsheets, and you've got to start to get into human interactions and how human works. The function of business is to improve the life of your customer. Life is another word for biology, and that it means engaging them on an emotional level. It means engaging their imagination. People want to live lives of purpose, of meaning, of direction, people want to experience joy. People want all of these kinds of things. Your employees, want to have fun at the same time they have a sense of satisfaction. We're not in the numbers game as humans. Humans are actually pretty bad at numbers. That's why I invented calculators, and that's why we invented computers. Not because calculators and computers are smarter than us, but because they do the thing that we're not good at. And so then don't confuse computers and calculators for your audience or for your employees, because they're actually the opposite of your employees and your customers.
Absolutely. So for any leader who thinks, wow, that makes so much sense, I want to put this into practice, where should they start?
Well, of course, the simplest thing if they want to read more about my stuff is just to pick up the book, which you can get anywhere, including at airports now. So that's Primal Intelligence. In general, what I would say, if you don't want to read the book, if you're like, I've heard enough of this Angus guy, I think he's nuts, I would spend more time talking with people who are different from you. Just have a conversation. See, how can I sustain a conversation with someone who is different from me? And a huge part of that process is going to activate your child brain, your sense of curiosity, in what makes someone different, what we find with a lot of people who are bad storytellers is that they are very quick to judgment. So they're low in curiosity. And what that means is that anytime they're spotting something that's different from what they expect, they see it as a negative and they try and dismiss it. Whereas people that are good storytellers, anytime they see something weird or unusual, they're like, whoa, that's interesting. Can I get more of that? So start having conversations with people who are different from you and resist asking why. Hold off on why. Instead, spend more time asking questions like what, how, where, because anytime you have a why, that's a pattern. What you're doing there is you're saying, I've got the answer. I've established a judgment. So the more you can kind of hold off on that and just open yourself to surprising details, exist in a state of suspended understanding. So you're thinking like, I don't understand this, or why is this happening? But I'm not going to ask why. I'm going to keep getting more information. So little simple things like that, having conversations with people who are different from you, resisting why instead asking what, that kind of stuff. You'll start to see these processes in your brain will activate pretty quick.
That's such good advice. And this is always my final question, Angus. What's your best piece of communications advice?
I mean, I'm sure this is the same advice that everybody gives, which is the secret to communication is listening. The better you are at listening, the better you are at communicating. And so, one of the things we often teach actors is we have them kind of, memorize a script. So they've learned a script and then focus entirely on the responses of the person as you're saying these words and see how, based on their responses, the words come out of you different because you're able to focus on them and then you're able to say the words differently. And what that means in a marketing sense is you don't necessarily have to change your message all the time. You don't necessarily need to change what you're saying, but the more you listen to your audience, the more that you can say it in a way that fits the moment. And so really, really, really good communicators are as close as possible to their audience. And that comes from listening, which comes from suspending judgments, being curious, and leaning into what is unique about every person that you talk to.
Amazing. Angus, thank you so much. Primal Intelligence, if you haven't read it, please get a copy. It's fantastic. It's my book of the year, 2025. Angus, thank you so much for being here. What's coming up next for you?
Doing a lot more work with U.S. Army Special Operations and, doing a little work to kind of bring that work into schools.
Into schools. Okay. Badly needed. So I think that's a fantastic idea and a great cause. Where can people find out more about you, the book, connect with you?
I'm not too much on social media, but I'm pretty much the only Angus in the state of Ohio. So if you Google Angus in Ohio, you'll find me pretty quick. And I'm pretty sure that's the only book that anyone has ever thought to title Primal Intelligence. So I think if you just Google Primal Intelligence, you'll find the book pretty quick. And there's also a free quiz, like a sort of a self-analysis, which will help you figure out your levels of intuition and imagination and emotion and common sense. If you go to my website, angusfletcher.co.
angusfletcher.co. Angus, thank you so much.
It's really a pleasure.
Thanks for watching. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Speak Like a CEO channel. It means the world to me and it helps us keep bringing you world-class insights and guests.